A subject that is known to everyone who at least reads the headlines, the refugee crisis and the recent mass migrations have undoubtedly impacted the political economy of modern society. This crisis has been played on the newsreel consistently in the EU and to a lesser extent the US for the past few years. An issue that is being harped up as a major political problem that threatens stability of developed countries in the so-called Western world. This view ignores the ongoing instability in developing countries caused by said Western world that allows for the mass migrations to happen in the first place. I've noticed a complete lack of nuance from both the left and the right on this subject. Now, before I get accused of throwing down some epic horseshoe theory like a radical centrist, let me be clear in saying that these two opposing ideologies lack nuance for completely different reasons. The right-wing criticism of immigration is completely racialized to the point where it ignores material reality and puts cultural impact front and center. While the left understands this concept, but it tends to overlook the negative societal impacts in favor of having a more humanitarian view of housing an unlimited amount of refugees. Both views lack hindsight. Mass migrations will continue to happen in a globalized society regardless of whether or not it is considered a good or a bad thing. The division of nations upholds the strict division of labor between the working classes. A common criticism is that immigrants drive down wages because they are willing to work for lower wages. The reality behind this issue is that the native working class either no longer wishes to work lower skilled jobs because wages are insufficient to pay for living standards, or higher education prevents them from even considering such low skilled jobs in the first place. The ruling class needs cheap labor for them to maximize profits, and since there's no local willing to work these jobs for a multitude of economic reasons, the ruling class decides to import foreign labor to fix this contradiction. Since labor demand for low-skilled workers is high and the supply is low, it would make sense to bring in more workers to push the supply and demand back to the equilibrium point. Even though automation and outsourcing has done more to damage national labor than immigration ever will, mass migrations are still blamed as a core problem for a variety of societal issues. In reality, it is imperialism that causes these mass migrations, and imperialism is to blame for the refugee crisis the West is currently experiencing. To blame the immigrant for all problems of society is to blame the symptoms and not the causes of such societal dysfunction. Immigrants and refugees are workers who fell prey to imperialist wars that destroyed their home countries. These are for-profit wars for resources that makes migrants flee to the very same countries that helped bomb them in the first place, essentially making all refugees economic migrants in one form or another. We need to unite with immigrants as workers to fight against imperialism that allows for the destabilization of people's lives. The imperialist powers of the world, USA, China, Russia, and to some extent the EU, use these wars to justify resource extraction from developing nations. To exploit these nations for oil and precious minerals is the true goal of these wars in the Middle East. Freedom and democracy are ideological covers for military intervention, and to blame them on all cultural issues ignores the economic base society is built on. Immigrants are workers just like the native working class. We must not confuse solidarity with immigrants with support of neoliberalism, market expansion for cheap labor, but neither should we fall for the ruling class using divide and conquer to get workers to fight amongst themselves over petty cultural or ethnic differences. We live in an economy that demands constant growth, including population growth, to help support an ever-growing economy. If the native working class does not produce enough offspring to grow the economy and consume, then the ruling class will seek to import cheap labor to cover the lack of growth and consumption that the localized working class is doing, or lack thereof. This allows a whole new generation of workers to be enslaved into debts and financial services that they can't pay back because they cannot understand the nature of their contracts. Corporations are happy as long as there are new people to be exploited and to be made a profit out of. The ruling class in each nation supports the importation of cheap labor, while the local and foreign populace of the working class does nothing but suffer the brunt force of increasingly competitive economic conditions. Nations are a necessary development for capital, and they will continue to exist as long as capital has a need for them. Do you think we will get rid of all borders, and do you think we can deport everyone who crosses an arbitrary line overnight, ignores the material development of nation states and markets? Nations and the division of labor will continue to exist as long as capital exists. From the time of European colonists to the present Syrian refugees, mass migrations will continue to be a material fact of human society and evolution. They have existed for as long as man could walk upright and use tools. To fetishize immigrants as either noble savages or barbarians does nothing to help their plight. They are not noble savages coming here to enrich our culture, nor are they barbarians coming to pillage it. They are merely people trying to escape a shitty situation. To think that right-wingers believe that the sole purpose of refugees is to come from a foreign land to take over is ridiculous, when in reality, all they wish to do is return home. This is pure ideological projection on the part of right-wingers, and they bury the truth in a racialized mess that does nothing but divide the working class and to serve the interest of capital. The right ignores the fact that a majority of the refugee migrant population reside in places like Turkey and Lebanon and not Europe. Right-wingers are idiotic to call the EU communists, but leftists are foolish to defend the EU as a knee-jerk reaction to fascistic backlash. Neoliberals who support open borders do so to ease the flow of cheap labor at the expense of both immigrants and locals alike. Liberals who support the EU need to realize that it is a tool for imperialism which creates refugees in the first place. The EU is nothing more than a neoliberal trading bloc comprised up of European nations. Opening the borders would loosen the regulations to allow capital flow more freely across the borders. It is unlikely to benefit the working class over the ruling class, since it is the ruling class who controls the border. It would make the flow of labor demand that much more competitive and bring rise to a fascist reaction. The right can keep blaming boogeymen like Soros and the EU, and the left can keep blaming fascists and racists, but it won't change the continuance of these mass migrations. We must attack the causes of mass migrations, namely imperialism and neoliberalism, and find a way that we as a society should handle and integrate these refugees into society as a whole. The EU is not communist, it is not leftist, it is not even socialist. The EU is merely a consolidation of capitalist power for the sake of special interests to control domestic and foreign markets.